Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jonathan Mangrum, the current editor-in-chief of the SAIS Review. So on behalf of our editorial board and the SAIS Review staff, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today for our first in-person launch event for the SAIS Review print journal in over 3 years. It's been since 2019. So this is a very special occasion. It is another one of those belated welcome back to in-person events from the pandemic. So we're very excited to have you all here today. We have a panel coming up with 4 guests. We have 2 of them will be authors, and 2 will be outside experts in international law from the DC community and beyond. And I'll save the welcoming for those guests until Ava Shin. She's our former editor-in-chief, will be joining us to introduce them. But next, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Cinnamon Dornsife with brief remarks on her expertise. She's currently a senior advisor of the International Development Program at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and executive director, of course, of the Foreign Policy Institute. Ambassador Dornsife is former ambassador to the Asian Development Bank. She has served in many high-profile roles, including executive director of the Asian Development Bank, advisor for the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, acting director and senior associate director of the Johns Hopkins SAIS International Development Program. She's been a consultant. She's done work on many nonprofits. She has wide experience as just a SAIS faculty member of more than 20 years. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Ambassador Dornsife to the stage.
Okay, with thanks to Jonathan Mangrum, our current editor-in-chief for the SAIS Review. I'd like to just start by giving you a background on the Foreign Policy Institute, and then give you a little bit of background on the SAIS Review itself. So SAIS houses research centers and institutes that basically complement the school's academic programs. The Foreign Policy Institute, the FPI, is the oldest of these. It was established in 1957 as the Washington Center for Foreign Policy Research and renamed the Foreign Policy Institute in 1980. So this is a venerable institution. It served its mission of uniting scholarship and policy at SAIS, and through research and scholarship that allows it to develop realistic solutions and answers to the international challenges facing the United States and the world. The SAIS Review of International Affairs, published by the Johns Hopkins University Press since 1980 also, is a leading academic journal that is focused on international policy. And it is led and managed, as you've already heard, by a competitively selected, that's new, team of students who are current students at SAIS, and in consultation with a distinguished board of advisors, and it's chaired by the SAIS Dean, who's going to be closing this session for us this afternoon. I serve as the journal's editorial advisor. The SAIS Review publishes essays that you're going to be hearing about today that link scholarship and inquiry into practical experience as it searches to bring a fresh policy-based perspective to global political, economic, and security questions. And our contributors come from a wide range of backgrounds, including academia, the government sector, the business sector, the private sector, non-governmental organizations. And so it is my pleasure now to welcome back our editor-in-chief from last year, Ava Shin. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ava Shin, and I graduated last May, and it's my pleasure to come back during my lunch break to introduce this issue that me and my editorial board has worked on when I was at SAIS during my last year. And first of all, I would like to give a huge thanks to the current editorial board for pushing this issue through the finish line. And as someone who has been in this role previously, I know how hard it is to balance your schoolwork and to actually produce a very professional and prestigious journal that you have today. And if you haven't already, please pick up an issue that is outside after this event is over. So first of all, I will talk about the inspiration of this issue. So this issue draws upon the sources of international law, treaties signed among states, traditions or norms by which states abide by when they engage with each other, and tribunals where states can go to resolve disputes. And we have 6 or 7 articles that are in this issue. And first, I would like to highlight the authors that are actually here, and also thanks to people who cannot join us here today. So first of all, Dr. Freeman and Dr. White worked on the Diplomatic Capacity Index, which illustrates the motives and methods that states join international bodies and agree to international law and norms. And this Diplomatic Capacity Index will actually be launched as well by the FPI, so that's very exciting. And the other author that is here today with us is Dr. Peter Martinez, who lays out the international law norms and institutions for space governance and analyzes how the existing legal framework struggles to adapt to the surge in outer space activities over the past decade. And I will not reveal a lot about the articles, and hopefully that you'll read them yourself. And there are other articles in this issue that cover issues from public health, which is very relevant amid, the COVID-19 pandemic and how the World Health Organization can, address these issues. We also have an article on international environmental responsibility, which is a very relevant topic as we, as a globe, try to address the problem of climate change. And lastly, there are other articles about sports diplomacy, and also the article that addresses the ambiguous terms used in international law and what the implications are for that. And with that, I will conclude my remarks, and maybe we can move on to the panel and the exciting questions that we will have. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Dornsife, Ava, Jonathan, for your wonderful remarks. I would also like to thank Isabel, Daniel, and Kosi on our editorial board, the former e-board, our authors, SAIS Review assistant editors, FPI Ginny, and the SAIS events, IT, and security teams for making this event possible today. Again, my name is Nayan. I am a second-year MAIR student and the senior editor on the SAIS Review editorial board. It is our absolute pleasure to be hosting this conversation today with our wonderful panelists here, which I will be introducing very shortly. Each of our panelists have incredibly busy schedules, so we're very fortunate to have a slice of their time today. To note, we will also be taking questions at around the 2:10 mark. Mics will be shared with you, so if you have any questions, please raise your hand. And I encourage our virtual attendees to please drop in any questions in the chat box. To begin, Professor Carla Freeman is a senior expert in the China program at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she specializes in Chinese foreign policy. For more than a decade, she was a member of the SAIS faculty, where she conducted research and taught on Chinese foreign policy, and directed the school's Foreign Policy Institute, where she launched the Diplomatic Capacity Index, or DCI for short. She is also a graduate of the Master's and PhD program here at SAIS. Dr. Peter Martinez is the executive director of the Secure World Foundation, which is right here near SAIS. He has extensive experience in multilateral space diplomacy, space policy formulation, and space regulation. Prior to joining the foundation, he led an 8-year process at the UN to negotiate a set of international consensus guidelines to promote the safety and sustainability of space operations. Professor Daniel Magraw is a senior fellow at the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute, president emeritus of the Center for International Environmental Law, and a professor teaching climate change and human rights at the University of Miami School of Law. He advises the UN on environmental, human rights, and investment law, and has extensive experience at NGOs and IGOs, businesses, and served in appointed positions under 4 US presidents. And Dr. Marsha A. Echols is the director of the World Food Law Institute and a professor at Howard University School of Law. She is a recognized expert in international food regulation and policy, with several publications and providing years of advice to the US Department of Agriculture and the Office of the US Trade Representative. She was also a member of the UN Administrative Tribunal and a panelist in a WTO trade dispute, among others. So as you've heard, we wanted to really highlight the diversity of the different areas of international law, and that the composition of this panel really culminates the different efforts concerning this area, including the Diplomatic Capacity Index, which I had the immense honor of working with Professor Freeman, Professor Mark White, who's tuning in live right now over Zoom. Jika Menga has a PhD candidate at SAIS on. And now I'd like to turn to our panelists here to provide some remarks regarding their articles that they worked on for this print edition and or their work concerning this area. So Professor Freeman, if you can please start us off. Yes. Oh, yeah.
And it's still, is it working now?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. It's really a delight and honor to be here and to join such a distinguished panel. And I could sound like the Academy Awards and give a long list of thank yous to people, but I want to thank the 2 generations of SAIS Review represented here. Of course, Cinnamon Dornsife, who has been so important in sustaining the project that we write about in this article, and Jika and Mark White as well. But delighted to be here. Just a little bit about the Diplomatic Capacity Index that we've referenced a couple of times. It's an idea that I had a few years ago, but it really wasn't until Mark White, who was an award-winning econ professor here at SAIS, joined me in working on it, that it got off the ground. And working with a number of really talented SAIS student researchers, we started to build a project that gathered data to start out with on 30 countries. So we now have a test index that covers 30 countries that looks at, tries to measure diplomatic capacity. This article in this issue is the second article that we have contributed to the SAIS Review. The first made a case for focusing on diplomatic capacity by rather than power alone, really defining power as the capacity to take diplomatic action rather than focusing on outcomes for a number of reasons I can get into. We demonstrated how the Diplomatic Capacity Index could be used to identify important patterns in diplomacy. In the second article, we really unpack some of the key concepts in the Diplomatic Capacity Index, focusing particularly on the idea of diplomatic access. Diplomatic access, as we define it, refers to a country's opportunities to interact with other international actors repeatedly and with significance. The interaction of countries in international governmental organizations in particular, and that has relevance for international laws, I hope we'll be able to discuss. This concept is one of several in the Diplomatic Capacity Index, including infrastructure, where we look at consulates and embassies as sort of the hardscape of diplomacy. We also look at leverageable assets. These are assets that countries can use, such as their economic size, maybe and other features, and then also the idea of standing, reputation. We have measures for all of these, drawing on data sets that are well vetted according to key criteria and are available publicly as well. So we compare data from diplomatic access class that we look at and look at 3 different countries: Brazil, India, and also Egypt. And I'll leave it there because we have 3 minutes and I probably exceeded the time frame, but look forward to discussing the findings in our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yep. And Peter, Dr. Martinez, please.
Thank you, Magraw. And it's a very interesting paper, Carla. I'm looking forward to reading it. Good afternoon. Thanks very much for the invitation to be here. It's a real honor and privilege. I'm Peter Martinez. I published the paper on the role of
Excuse me, Dr. Martinez, is your mic on? If you push down on the power button.
Good afternoon. Great pleasure to be here. I'm Peter Martinez. I published the paper on the role of law in space governance and the role of international institutions. It was a great pleasure to work with the SAIS review team. I've published many papers in my professional career, and I must say that publishing a paper in SAIS review was one of the more pleasant experiences, so kudos to the team. Really great work. Really, the editorial process I thought was very thorough and really did result in a better paper, so congratulations to the team. So when people think about space, especially those who are not in the space community, often ideas like the space exploration, astronauts, planetary missions, those are the things that come to mind. But in fact, most of the satellites in space are put there to provide services and data to people on the ground. And the world has become increasingly reliant, I would say critically reliant, on space services. Space has become part of the plumbing of modern life, and most people aren't even aware of it. And we live bathed in a sea of space-derived data, information, and services, and we've just become accustomed to relying on it, and we just take it for granted that these services will continue to be there tomorrow. But that's not really the case. There are a number of threats to the continuity of those space-derived services, and I can tell you that a day without space would be a really bad day for most of us. Now, the existing governance framework for space activities was developed in the early days of the space age, in the late 50s, 60s, and through the 70s, before the advent of a large commercial sector. In those days, the dominant space actors were the 2 superpowers, the Soviet Union and the USA, and a few other countries, and most of the space actors were state entities, not private sector. The situation today is completely the opposite, and yet space law, as it currently exists, the international framework, is predicated on states being the dominant actors. So this has created situations where there are now challenges to space governance, and in my paper I outlined 6 of these. The first is the increasing congestion in outer space. There are currently around 10,500 active satellites in space. That's just the ones that are working. I'm not counting the ones that are defunct. If you start counting defunct objects, there are about 32,000 objects, or over 32,000 objects, that are large enough to be tracked, and so therefore can be followed consistently, and many hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of smaller fragments, non-functional objects that we collectively refer to as space debris, or that are popularly mentioned, described as space junk. There is a growing autonomy. You can imagine that as the space environment is getting more crowded, the traditional way of avoiding collisions, which is where operators pick up a phone and phone another satellite operator to decide who moves, that's no longer feasible. And in future, we will see a greater deployment of artificial intelligence, autonomous collision avoidance systems, and this will make it much harder to maintain order in outer space. And so it will require much stronger coordination among space operators. We're also seeing a shift in the way that space is perceived. Space orbits around the Earth and the spectrum that satellites use are now being seen as limited natural resources that have to be used equitably and rationally. The second major area of challenge is space debris, as I've mentioned, and this is spent upper stages of rockets, defunct satellites, and fragments of those. The third area that poses a challenge is the emergence of new kinds of space activities that weren't envisaged even 10, 15 years ago. Those pose exciting opportunities for a future space economy, and I'm talking about things such as on-orbit servicing of satellites, life extension of satellites on orbit, those kinds of things. But we don't have international norms on how to conduct such close proximity operations safely in orbit. And so work needs to be done in this regard. And I'm happy to say that the private sector is playing a very important role in developing such norms. The fourth area is the proliferation of counterspace capabilities. As more states become critically reliant on space, they want to ensure that their space assets are protected from attack by adversaries in times of conflict. And this has led to a development of so-called counterspace technologies, which can be kinetic, cyber, or electromagnetic. And so there is a need to have clear understanding of what these capabilities are and also norms of behavior for military actors in space. This brings me to the fifth area, which is the dual-use nature of space technologies, which can be used either for peaceful purposes or for defense or military purposes. And so this requires actors to be very transparent about their intentions. And here I'm talking about things like close proximity operations, such as on-orbit servicing, requires transparency from commercial actors if they are not to raise concerns by the operators of satellites from other countries. And the sixth area is a growing number of space investors or people entering the space domain who are not traditionally space actors and do not realize that they are entering a fragile and strategic domain. And this raises questions about responsible investment in space activities and what that looks like. Because many of the approaches that are traditional in the venture capital industry may not be very good for ensuring space sustainability. So my paper is about the role of international law and institutions in addressing these challenges. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
If you press down on the power button, it should work.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Well, it's great to be here. It's an honor to be invited, and it's always wonderful to be on the stage with Marsha or Carla and my new colleague, Peter. I want to begin by congratulating the SAIS review on this issue. If you look at the table of contents, it covers a lot of very, very important developing issues. And not all of them, of course, and I have comments on both of what Carla and Peter have already said that hopefully there'll be time for later. But what I want to talk about is what I think is the most important development in international law last year, which is the universal recognition of the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And this culminated over 30 years of work by many, many people, and Carla's comments about diplomatic capacity come to mind, because for a long time it was driven by NGOs and academics, and many of us don't have that capacity. But by the end, there were a number of countries that were very much in favor of this, and we were having weekly Zoom meetings among civil society actors from all over the world to strategize. The process, as I said, started over 30 years ago, and milestones include the Inuit case against the United States, arguing that the U.S.'s actions regarding climate change violate the human rights of the Inuit. That was in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights here in Washington. In the end, the commission decided not to go ahead, but the case succeeded in terms of putting a human face on climate change. Up to that point, it was all economics and science, and from that point on, we've known that people are involved as well. And then there was a group of small island developing countries that drafted the first international instrument on the human dimension of climate change. That was the Male Declaration. That was 2007. In 2012, we were able to get the Human Rights Council to appoint a special rapporteur on human rights and environment, and that was a real process, and it's fascinating, actually. If I had more than 3 minutes. Well, I will spend a second on that. We first tried to get a special rapporteur on climate change and human rights. It was clear that too many countries disagreed with that, including the U.S. Then we moved, well, we did a pivot, and we said, well, how about a broader topic, human rights and environment? And the U.S. was still very opposed, but the main diplomat working on this in Geneva represented the Maldives. And at that point, the U.S. wanted a special rapporteur on Iran and climate change and human rights. But the Muslim countries were blocking that. And the Maldives representative said to the U.S., we will block the Muslim countries' objection, which it had the power to do, if you will support the special rapporteur on human rights and environment. And so it was a pure horse trade, and that's how we got that special rapporteurship. And the fellow has all sorts of diplomatic capacity, and he did a fabulous job. In any event, in 2021, in October, the Human Rights Council recognized the right to a healthy environment by a vote of 63-0 to 4. The big opponents were the U.S., of course, and Russia, and for a while the UK and France and Brazil, but we were able to deal with those three. The U.S. didn't have a vote then, as you'll recall, because President Trump had withdrawn us from the Human Rights Council. Otherwise, there would have been at least one negative vote. But then we went to the General Assembly, and that was a real fight as well. We finally got the U.S. to change its opposition. If you're interested in that, I can describe it later. So the vote was 161-0 to 8. And that was the most overwhelming vote in favor of a human right in the history of the General Assembly. And so you say, well, why is that? What happened since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which doesn't include any environmental right? And again, we can talk about that, but it's a very interesting process. It's a very important one. It matters, this right, and again, we can talk about that during the discussion. But let me just spend a couple of minutes, or a minute, I guess, on what it means. I mean, what is the right? Well, it has 6 substantive components to it. The right to clean air, clean water, clean and healthy food, to make sure I don't miss any of these, a non-toxic environment to work and live and play, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, and then a healthy climate. So those are the substantive components of it. There's a whole toolkit of what I would call the normal human rights to access to information, to participate, to freedom of opinion, assembly, and those sorts of things. And the functional purpose for all of that is to provide an environment that's capable of supporting our society and the full enjoyment of human rights. And that functional purpose is stated in the Male Declaration that I mentioned from 2007. So with that, let me stop. I hope you're as excited about it as I am, and we can talk more about it. Thank you.
Well, let me also thank the current and former editors of the journal and the review. It's my honor to be here. Thank you for including me in this launch event, which is a special occasion, bringing together the persons who have written for the review, but also others who are interested in the international law issues that have been addressed. This whole idea of treaties, traditions, and tribunals is a very broad coverage, and I think that you have done a wonderful job of trying to pull together different expertises and views from a legal and a policy perspective. So thank you very much for including me. And I would also like to say it again, like Dan said, it's very happy to be on a panel with him again. We've known each other for more years than we want to say, and so, but it's happy to be here again. So thank you for that. I'd also like to mention that one of my students from Howard's Law School is here. He was working at the World Bank and decided to walk over, and so I'm happy to have him here. I hope that some of my students are also online to have Howard participation even virtually in this event. So my focus, as you've been told, is food law, trade, dispute resolution. And I want to focus today on the food law issues, and just to sort of counterbalance some of the issues of the data space law, but also in a way to extend the discussion of the work that was done recently at the United Nations. I've been working on presentations and publications about the right to food, and I am about to be a scholar at University of Vermont's Summer Institute on food law, and my focus is going to be on water, but in a very limited perspective. I'm very interested in the Chesapeake Bay region and regional water, and how it is important for not just the environment, but for labor, for culture, and providing food for a particular region. The Chesapeake region is very large, covers several states, but just trying to think about it as a microcosm of what could be done in terms of regional cooperation, I think was important. The World Food Law Institute, which I direct, just created a series of roundtables last year, diplomatic roundtables, about regional cooperation regarding water and water management, other issues like this. And I think if we begin to look at the importance of water, some of the limitations that we are addressing even in the United States, it is important to think about regional cooperation in that area. But maybe in addition to that, I would just like to go back to the whole question of food. So water is important for food. I think of food, there is a right to food, there is a right to water in human rights law. So what is the law? Where do you find it? The right to food is included in the Universal Declaration. It is implemented and expanded in a UN declaration. So I think just considering what you call the quote law of the right to food means that to some extent you are delving into areas that many lawyers would not consider obligatory law. Really, we might be looking at soft law, but certainly human rights experts have agreed through the United Nations that there is a right to food and there is a right to water. So those are concepts that we can build on. In addition, the United Nations rules have gone on to say that with that right to food, there are responsibilities of governments providing for adequate food, and in doing that, the food must be accessible, it must be adequate, there are certain concepts of obligations that are imposed on governments to protect their citizens and provide food for them. So food, to me, is an essential for our existence. We can't survive without food and without water. So when we say there are rights, then concomitantly there are obligations and responsibilities of on governments. If we look at the circumstances that the world, even the United States, faces today, how do governments actually carry forward some of the responsibilities that are imposed on them? The governments in Ukraine, how do you provide adequate food for all of the citizens? The government in, let's say Ethiopia, in a conflict situation. In New Zealand, where there are now floods. In Kenya, floods and droughts. Regions of the United States, how our governments are to implement the responsibilities that go along with a right to food. So I think that's a challenge that we think of, and as we think of what is involved in Ukraine, for example, we begin to see the range of issues and the difficulties that arise in providing enough food, adequate food, access to food for citizens. What are the challenges, and how do you overcome them? One of the possibilities, and what is already being discussed, to me is a possibility that you might think of in Chapter 9 of the UN Charter, when they talk about cooperation. So more and more there is cooperation among different types of entities to achieve social goals, economic goals, cultural goals. And so perhaps building on that, expecting that collaboration, cooperation is something that we could build on as we go forward, because the challenges are so great. I've just talked about Ukraine, but you think about Turkey and Syria at this point. So what can be done? How do you really access or provide access to adequate food, to affordable food, and so on? So I think that just thinking more about the collaborations, which have already begun, have been going on at the United Nations with different summits, different meetings, this Sustainable Development Goals, and the focus on food, adequate food. I think we just have to build on those. And then remember that food is individual. We can think about government's responsibilities and so on, but going to the foundation, food is provided for us, each of us individually, for our sustenance, and remembering that people are at the center of what we are provided for food, building in from the farm and going forward. So just thinking about individuals also. I think I'll stop there, but I think there's just more to think about in terms of how we address basic needs of citizens, whether it's food, whether it's water, whether it's a clean and safe environment. Thank you.
Thank you to each of our speakers for providing some remarks and just a glimpse into some very important work, especially tied to the theme of our print edition. I would like to start with Professor Freeman and your article, The Power of Diplomatic Access, International Organizations in the Diplomatic Capacity Index, or DCI for short. Professor Freeman, I'm curious, in what instances will the Diplomatic Capacity Index be useful analytically? And how has this index been used to better understand the concept of diplomatic access?
Well, Naon, I think you could answer those questions since you're a co-author on this article. But the whole idea of this, the DCI, was to highlight the importance of diplomacy as a dimension of national power, because it actually can illustrate that that states can take action using diplomacy on the international stage and have an impact. And the question of diplomatic access is particularly interesting because what it shows, we looked at 157 different international organizations and states' membership in those. It shows that access actually is significant, that states do a lot of interacting with each other through these organizations. And looking at the 30 countries that we have indexed so far, and by the way, this is a test index, and we are eager to go forward and include all countries in the world in this index, but we need funding to do that. We're grateful to the Foreign Policy Institute for having gotten us this far. But we, in looking at access, it's really interesting. All of the 30 countries that we examined, no country is a member of all organizations, and that makes sense since some have foci that are not of interest to particular states, but many participate in more than in close to half, and there are surprises that this index reveals. For example, in among our 30 countries, the country with the largest membership of all is Belarus. Something you would not expect. So countries are looking for ways to leverage their international influence on the international stage, and international organizations, whether they're treaty organizations, whether they're alliances, whether they are clubs, make a difference and are important to diplomatic power on the international stage. There are some implications for small countries from saying that, and there are some implications for the United States as well that maybe we can talk about a little bit later.
Thank you so much. And I also want to add that sheer size matters for these countries. Their population, their GDP, it all really matters, and this really translates. It's also the importance of translating the size of these countries into participation, their leadership, their membership in these different international governmental organizations. Thank you so much, Professor Freeman. Yeah. Yes, please.
On the issue of size mattering, it does matter, but it's not the size of individual incomes that make a difference. Actually, we find that it's big countries, often developing countries, who exercise the most influence in this access measure on the international stage. So looking at the countries with the highest DCI scores, you will recognize many of the large countries in certain regions that have large populations and large territorial sizes, but maybe among some some countries with fairly low individual GDPs.
Absolutely. And we also have more information regarding the Diplomatic Capacity Index on the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute's website. Thank you, Professor Freeman. Dr. Martinez, in your article, Rules-Based Order in Outer Space, the Role of International Law and Institutions, and in your remarks, you covered about space governance and the importance of multilateral institutions and the private sector collaborating. I would like to ask you, China is developing its space capabilities at a rapid pace that is challenging the United States' position as the world's dominant space power. Given the deteriorating relationship between those two countries, exacerbated by recent events as we've seen in the news, and your article mentioning that there's this growing mistrust and suspicions regarding each country's space projects. How, Dr. Martinez, how optimistic should we be that rule of law will prevail in space? even with the collaborative role between multilateral institutions and the private sector.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Indeed, the mistrust is very deep on both sides. And each side suspects the other of bad intentions and believes that the other side is quite capable of ignoring the rule of law when it suits them to do so. However, in space, no actor or group of like-minded actors, no matter how capable they are, whether they're state actors or commercial actors, can ensure the safety and security of their space activities through their efforts alone. And everyone is aware of this, despite occasional irresponsible actions that we see from time to time. And the alternative to rule of law in space is either utterly lawless behavior or irresponsible behavior. And that is bad for everybody, including the bad actors themselves. And we see examples of what is not illegal behavior in terms of international law, but would be considered as unfriendly or irresponsible actions. And these are things like stalking of satellites, either state satellites or commercial satellites, or particularly irresponsible actions nowadays with the congested space environment is destructive anti-satellite tests that produce lots of debris that pose a danger for everybody, including the countries that conduct those tests. For example, there was since you asked about China, there was a 2007 Chinese ASAT test that still has debris in space that is posing a hazard to operational spacecraft today. More recently, tests were conducted by India and the Russian Federation, and these tests continue to pose threats, not only to all users of space, but also to the countries that did those. So this is why I think, but having said this, states will act in their own self-interest, and it is in their own self-interest to maintain space as a safe, stable, and predictable operating domain. And this is why last year in the General Assembly of the United Nations, there was a draft resolution that was proposed by a large number of countries and was passed with a vote of 155 states in favor, encouraging countries to refrain from conducting destructive anti-satellite tests in space. And we think this is a very timely and promising development. Now, going back to your question about China, China is also developing its commercial space sector, and Chinese commercial space operators have exactly the same operational concerns as their Western competitors. And this isn't an issue of just a few major space powers. There are many, many new actors in space. Most of them are non-governmental. And so the irresponsible actions of even one relatively minor player could have major consequences, unpredictable and long-lasting consequences for all other actors. And that's why we need these multilateral institutions where these issues can be discussed and new governance frameworks can be established. Now, one might ask, will such treaties and norms ever, with such treaties and norms, will we never ever see bad behavior? Of course not. Every country in the world has laws against theft and murder, and we still see crimes being committed. But the point is that having these rules in place is better than having no rules at all. And I'll close by saying that enforcement of these international obligations ultimately is the responsibility of the individual states through their national regulatory and legal frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's absolutely true what you mentioned, that it's really up to these different individual countries to step up in terms of collaborating and having a presence and collaborating with one another, negotiating with one another in order to have a good space governance policy internationally. So thank you so much for sharing. Professor Magraw, you are a steadfast advocate for tackling and combating climate change and protecting the rights of indigenous peoples. You center your work on humans and their right, in your remarks you mentioned their right to a clean, safe, and healthy environment. you mentioned in your remarks the Inuit people, right? So I'd like to ask you in regards to the, going back to the 2005 Inuit petition, which was a petition, like you mentioned, that was filed to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights that argued that the US committed human rights violations against the Inuit people through its contribution to global warming. And you argued that, quote, strategic litigation can be effective if it is part of a broader campaign for change, end quote. Fast forward today to COP27, which happened just last fall. Professor Magraw, how has the growth of the presence and activism of Indigenous communities changed how nations approach international treaties on climate change, if at all any?
Thank you. Yes, you can hear this. Well, if we start with the Inuit, that's an obvious situation where it's indigenous peoples that made that claim. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Arctic, it's warming at a rate that's much, much faster than the rest of the world. And that's essentially destroying the culture and the livelihoods and the safety of the people that live up there. The indigenous peoples that live there live very close to the ice, as you will, and it's really destroying their cultures and their human rights. And that same kind of claim is being made with respect to many activities that relate to climate change, including exploration and exploitation of petroleum resources and that sort of thing. And what we saw at Sharm el-Sheikh is a group of, I say a group, there are quite a few indigenous peoples representatives there, quite a few less than there were representatives of the oil industry by numbers. But still, it was quite a large group historically, and they made their voices heard. And the powers that are arrayed against reasonable climate action obviously are intense. The capitalist system is not set up to deal with this kind of issue. And indigenous peoples have a different voice. Of course, it's not just one voice, many different groups of indigenous peoples, but their voice is that, we've been here a long time, we did not destroy the environment, and so there is a way to do this, and you should listen to our wisdom as well as to wisdom from other sources. The big development at Sharm el-Sheikh was the loss and damage. It had to do with the loss and damage issue, which was also pushed very hard by developing countries, many of which are not particularly sensitive to indigenous peoples' interests. So it was a combination of those two that really push very hard for that. And we'll see where that goes. If it does, in fact, take off, that will be a very important part of the climate resolution. The other thing I would say is that there's a danger in talking only about climate change. I'm not accusing you of that. But we're in the midst of a number of environmental crises. Very soon there are going to be more plastic in the ocean than fish in your lifetimes, right? If we continue doing business as usual. There are all sorts of toxic chemicals that are affecting all of us. Sperm counts are down around the world, et cetera, et cetera. That's the pollution part. Biodiversity, as you know, is crashing at an alarming rate. And water supply, going back to what Marsha said, water, many parts of the world are already water short. If you pay attention to what's happening in the southwest part of the United States right now, you know that we are having a similar problem. So there are a lot of different, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's antimicrobial resistance, which poses a real threat. I was at the International Maritime Organization 2 weeks ago doing a human rights review, and they pointed out that one of the new issues for outer space is space launch pollution of the oceans. That is, people are just, people, commercial entities, countries, they send up their launch vehicle and then they dump it in the ocean. We don't have laws about that, maybe. Maybe the London Dumping Convention deals with that, but it's not clear. So these issues keep coming up, but we can't only think about climate change. The right to a healthy environment is a comprehensive approach to that. It includes both water and food that you mentioned, Marsha. And so hopefully we can look at these things in a broad and constructive manner.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought that up because when we often talk about indigenous peoples, for example, we talk broadly about just climate change, but it also deals with biodiversity and dumping in oceans as well. So thank you so much for mentioning that as well. Speaking of human rights, food is a human right. An equitable food system is a human right. So Dr. Echols, I would like to ask, as we've seen at the Tokyo Nutrition for Growth Summit in 2021, for example, participating nations committed to a framework that includes various initiatives to promote good health and nutrition at both the local and national levels. One important goal is to build a more resilient and equitable food system. In your opinion, how can this be and what should be achieved on the local level?
Thank you again for the question. Before I answer, I'd like to go back to a point that Dan mentioned. Your publication addresses tribunals also. The Inter-American Commission is a tribunal that has been, to me, in the forefront of moving forward issues regarding human rights in the Americas in particular, but they have set an example for other human rights bodies. The African Commission on Human Rights, for example, has taken similar positions, but has been watching what happened in Latin America. So I would say when you're thinking about tribunals, the future, whether it's of environmental protection, human rights, right to food, which the Inter-American Commission has discussed, I just think you've got to remember that commissions or bodies, tribunals, other than those that you think of as big bodies, can have a very major influence on the way law develops, the way concern for persons develop and are expressed. So that the Inter-American Commission, to me, has focused on people, on land, on their land, and I just think that's worth acknowledging more than most of us usually do. So it's taken part of my time, but I think it's important to mention that. With regard to the nutrition and food systems, I think there has developed a greater review of food systems. And you think of what that could mean, what that could include, and that might vary with different persons. But certainly, we're talking about a system, again, I go back to what has happened in Ukraine. The system really cannot provide the background for farmers for producing, the fertilizer, the seeds, the safety of farmers on their farmland, the transport of grains from Ukraine to the countries in Africa, the Middle East, and other places that rely on it, access, affordability, and so on. So the system approach, again, as Dan was mentioned, is more of a holistic approach, which I think is important. And it is growth, it's production, it's processing, it's transport, it's safety and so on. It's just looking holistically at what happens with regard to food, its production, and its availability to us as consumers.
Thank you so much. And I like how you mentioned the holistic part, because oftentimes, especially at an international setting, oftentimes people don't really think about that, especially on the local level. We often don't really think about the safety of farmers, for example, like you mentioned. So I really hope our audience can really think about that local aspect, the importance of that moving forward. So thank you so much, Dr. Echols. Now I'd like to move on and ask our panelists to collectively discuss a question I want to ask, which is when we discuss international law, including treaties and tribunals, we often dismiss or, like I mentioned, neglect the importance of the local level. In relation to your work, why is dismissing or neglecting the local level in this context problematic in the short term and long term? So if anyone would like to start, please.
So perhaps I can just share some recent experiences from the space sector. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, international space law, of which there are 5 UN treaties, sets the scene for space governance, and the obligations, the treaty obligations, are implemented through national legislation. However, not all countries have national legislation. More and more countries are entering the space domain. Some of the new entrants haven't signed the basic space treaties, and that's a challenge. So national level regulation is essential for avoiding a fragmented and divergent regulation, and it leads to, which could lead to things like regulation shopping. We've seen examples of what can happen with some space activities that fall through regulatory cracks. In 2018, there was a private company that launched a number of very, very small satellites that were too small to be trackable. The original application was denied by the FCC here in the US, but this company nevertheless went ahead and procured a launch on a foreign launch vehicle, launched the satellites, and then they were subsequently fined. More recently, there was another mission to land a spacecraft on the surface of the moon. As it happened, the spacecraft crashed, and then after the crash, it transpired that tardigrades, these are microorganisms, had been placed on the spacecraft without anybody knowing about it, which was a contamination of the lunar surface. And this is an example of what I call a chain of custody issue. You're having more and more space activities being conducted across national jurisdictions. So it becomes very important for national regulators to firstly have national regulation in place, but for regulators to talk to each other. And we're seeing, as we start to see the proliferation of very large constellations with thousands of satellites, which raise issues of, the equity of allocating orbital positions to such very large space systems, and what happens with the end-of-life disposal. For example, these satellites re-entering the atmosphere and burning up. That's going to affect atmospheric chemistry, which may have implications for climate change. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. In the food area, local is very important, and certainly in different ways. One, consumers are becoming much more concerned about what they eat. I would make that a local issue, because consumers are operating within certain geographic contexts and certain cultural or traditional contexts. So I think that for more and more for consumers and the businesses that are serving consumers, local and local considerations are becoming much more important. In terms of law and regulation, there are beginning to be some definitions of local and what that means, and the regulations might vary depending on whether a product is produced locally or not. Another way of thinking about local in the food area is we've talked about food and nutrition, and right to food to me is largely based on physical necessities. There are cultural, I would say, cultural imperatives also, not necessities in the same way, but we are, I guess, as we eat, we are considering our culture, and the one way you might think about including that in food law and regulation might be in what are called dietary guidelines. They're basically focused on nutrients, how many calories you eat, how, and so on. But I think beginning with Brazil a few years ago, Canada and some other countries, they're beginning to look at local in terms of consumers' needs, a group of consumers. So saying it's important to eat your vegetables, it's important to eat enough calcium, but eat those in family or in a community, or using local products, local foods, so that you're not eating only processed foods. So the local, I think, can be translated into national approaches. And these are guidelines, they're not law, they're not regulation, but still, I think, beginning to recognize that what is local is healthy, is important, but also local might be a local community and a focus on that, and being together in community as we eat meals. UNESCO, I think, when we think about the UNESCO recognition of the French meal, I mean, it's just saying there's something special about being together in a communal setting, in an informal setting, and enjoying food as a part of life.
Yeah, well, let me make two types of comments. The first has to do with food. As my students know, my sister-in-law won the World Food Prize, which is the Nobel Prize in Agriculture, for her work changing from dealing with vitamin A deficiency through pills, which were imported into countries and distributed to mothers who in turn were supposed to give them to their children, to diet. And you'd think, well, that's obvious, right? Wouldn't you want to have your nutrition through your diet? But it took a long time to get funding for that, and then now she's reached tens of millions of people in Africa. But the point there is that if you really want food security, you don't want to rely on pills that are being imported from some other country. The second point about this is we haven't talked at all about the grotesque inequities in the world right now, but one of them has to do with gender. And in Africa anyway, a lot of the small farmers are, not small farmers, but small holding farmers are women. And it's important that the development of crops and the availability of inputs and that sort of thing be effective in terms of just reaching that side of gender equality. The other thing I was going to say, just as a general matter, there's that old saying about you're supposed to think globally and act locally, and that's partly because of what Peter was talking about. If you have a nice treaty, if it's not implemented in a national way, then it means nothing. But it goes much further than that, of course, with something like climate change or pollution. That is that it requires all of us to actually change our lifestyles. And we have to do that. I mean, we're facing a real crisis right now, and the young people here, I think, are aware of that, and the older people here are ignoring it. At least I am in terms of my lifestyle, but in large part. But we need to act at that local level. I think also now we have to think locally and act globally as well, because we need international cooperation. And this goes back to the size matter kind of thing. The countries that pushed the right to a healthy environment, it was a core group of 5 countries, Costa Rica, Morocco, Switzerland. These are not big countries, but they worked together. They had very good diplomats, Slovenia, extremely good diplomats. And they worked that way. It wasn't a size thing at all. It was more energy and skill and a message.
I just wanted to make a couple of points about the diplomatic capacity index and the idea of local. If local means national, obviously we're focused on measuring national power and looking at diplomacy as a feature of national power. We want to say jaw-jawing matters on the international stage, and I think when you aggregate things, you do lose these stories of countries that have invested a lot in their diplomacy for certain interests and towards certain goals. But the overall picture is one in which international law, international interaction through diplomatic organizations, membership organizations, is really significant for states to be able to align their interests, their values, and their goals on the world stage. But to the point of local, our index focuses on, it's very state focused. It's focused on governments. And that leaves out a lot of voices. For example, you mentioned the Inuit, and they are not captured here. So, for example, trying to tie everything together, one of the articles I read recently about mega constellations was about the potential costs to the night sky from just the number of mega constellations that could be deployed, that are planned, could literally eradicate what we think of as the night sky. We would have a bright night sky, and that has impacts for the cultural practices of many indigenous groups around the world, as well as probably significant impacts on other natural functions of the Earth itself. So these are significant culturally existential, even to the way we live, issues that we need to think about. So we are trying to encourage a greater focus through our index on diplomacy over just measuring power through the military lens, but we have to acknowledge that it doesn't capture. It doesn't work for all groups on the international stage. Those without governments that are represented in the international organizations that we look at.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to each of our panelists. Now we'll go into our Q&A session. We don't have the time. About 10 minutes. Can we ask one question? Follow up? Okay. Perfect. Before we bring up Ian Steinberg for his closing remarks, please join me in giving a round of applause to each of our panelists here.